Today on the Elmore Leonard Podcast, we are so excited to share our conversation with Megan Abbott. Megan is the best-selling and Edgar Award-winning author of over a dozen books, including Dare Me, Queenpin, The Turnout, and the upcoming Dorado Drive, a New York Times summer book pick. In addition to adapting Dare Me into a show on Netflix, she's currently collaborating with Scott Frank on two projects, one for film and the other for television. She also writes nonfiction, and we've included links to a few of her essays in the show notes, as well as an interview she did with Elmore a few years ago. Please enjoy this mysterious, troubling, and fascinating conversation with the spectacular Megan Abbott. Welcome back, everyone, to the Elmore Leonard Podcast. Today we are thrilled to have Dr. Megan Abbott here, the doctor of all forms of writing, fiction and nonfiction. Megan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. The doctor I only use when I need to get a dinner reservation, but I appreciate
Does it help?
No, it never helps. But it is. I mean, I'm very glad for all my advanced degree efforts. But really, it's a little bit of misnomer.
I'm really excited to get to talk to you today about Elmore, but not just about Elmore. I think one of the things that I think you share with him is you are both so great at playing with shifting power dynamics within a story and among characters, among so many other things. But I think that it is one of the things that he does best, and I think you do it so well. And so I'm really excited to get to talk to you today. I know you grew up in Detroit. Was he a local author to you? Were you growing up? Were you a fan of his, or how did you first come across Elmore and his work?
Yeah, he did loom pretty large, as a kid in Detroit in the 80s. He was, our famous author, and, the Dickens of Detroit and all that. So he was a big presence, and when there started to be movie adaptations, etc., he was an even larger presence. So I don't remember not knowing of him, even though, he would, for long stretches he would be away from Detroit, etc. But we always come as our own, even when he was in other places. So I just don't remember a world before Elmore Leonard, nor would I want to.
Was there a specific book? I think I have a sense of what your favorite book might be, but was there one book in particular that just sort of grabbed you and you said, oh gosh, I got to pay more attention to this guy. I need to read more of his stuff?
Yeah, it really was in the 90s. So when Jackie Brown came out, and when Out of Sight and Get Shorty, so I went to the books that inspired those adaptations, and they were sort of revelatory for me. In part, you can see why Hollywood was so eager to adapt him, but the books have these things that the movies could never have, because it's just a different medium, and the books are so much more character driven and granular and like loosey goosey, and there's such great hangs, and I didn't really know you could do that with crime fiction, where sometimes they used like, what's the mystery and what's the crime? I mean, we're hanging out with criminals, but there doesn't seem to be an organizing crime, and it just felt like he just made up his own rules, which felt like a kind of freedom to me.
Who else? So like growing up, so like it's hard to escape Elmore growing up in Detroit, but who were some of your other like favorite writers? Like, did you always want to be a novelist?
No, I didn't really know how you became a novelist. It always seemed sort of like a fantasy to me. So I sort of backed into it. In school, I sort of became obsessed with crime fiction. I had read a lot of true crime as a kid. I really loved, I was one of those helter-skelter kids. It's like two generations of crime novelists first discovered helter-skelter as a kid at the used bookstore. So, but I didn't really read. Well, as a teenager, I started to read James Ellroy, and that was really big for me because of my love for for movies in Hollywood and LA, fascination with LA, I kind of miss
Yeah.
LA. But really, it was really later when I was at NYU that I discovered really who become iconic for me of the previous generation before Elmore Leonard, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Dashiell Hammett, Jim Thompson, all those dudes that just completely warped my brain and changed my life. And just yeah, I was sort of in some ways working backwards in the lineage and just loving everything I uncovered. So it was really late, it sort of came in a, I guess like there is no linear time anymore, but as they say, but it really was a kind of backwards discovery of who these writers were that had begun this American hard-boiled tradition.
Was there a moment where you're reading Carver or James Elroy or somebody and you say to yourself, I'm gonna I'm gonna go do this?
I was reading back to back. I read two Raymond Chandler and two James M. Cain books in a row. And they were The Big Sleep, Farewell, My Lovely by Chandler, and Postman Always Rings Twice, and Double Indemnity by Cain. And I knew the movie versions very well, but I'd never read the books. And the books are, I love those movies, but the books are really so much more mysterious and troubling and fascinating. And that really I just wanted to write my way into the world of those books. So that's when I started writing something that became my first novel ultimately. But it was really a desire to enter that world. And there's also not a lot of women in those worlds, especially women, real women.
Yeah.
So it felt like exciting to sort of place like a regular woman in some male dominated books.
I think one of the other things that Elmore is really known for, and I think you'll take somebody who might be perceived as a villain or a bad person or something, and then but you get the full picture. I've read some of your essays about femme fatales and in terms of like,
He doesn't think in terms of heroes and villains at all. He doesn't even really, he often would say there are some bad guys, but his bad guys are, everyone has their reasons, and it helped me so much with character. I mean, I go back to it all the time. I mean, sometimes people will say they can't find a single likable character in any of my books, and I take that as a compliment because they're not trying to be liked, they're just trying to be people and they're trying to be real. And I just always loved that Elmer Leonard always talked about that was not interesting to him, and that he didn't think in those terms, he didn't judge his characters, and I never wanted to too. So that to me is probably the number one thing that I took from his books, is that you're not seeing any kind of judgment.
I think it might be it's either Glitz or Mr. Mercedes where he's just kind of like, okay, that person was a bad guy, but pretty much everyone else is just a person. So you are spending more and more time in television. You're not only writing books, you're also making television. How did you first start working on The Deuce? Was that your first job as in television?
No, it wasn't. The first thing was I began adapting my book Dare Me in 2012 for a
Oh,
feature. It was originally supposed, so that actually began, even though it came out in 2019, well, late 2019, that I originally, you know how Hollywood development is, it was originally sold as a feature film, and I was
hmm.
adapted to write, and it almost went forward. So that was my first experience, was you're writing a feature film script. You've never written a script in your life. Ironically, that was the same year that I interviewed Elmore Leonard, and I now I laugh to myself because he often would say very humorous things about Hollywood and Hollywood executives, and I should have taken heed for some of it. He
Oh
definitely
man.
had a gimlet-eyed view of Hollywood, and but my experience with Dare Me ultimately was a a great deal. It took forever, but it's a rarity when you actually get to make the thing. But it was during that long development process that I got hired to work on the Deuce. So that was my first and only writer's room experience, other than my own room that I ran.
So what's it like going from being completely in charge of everything as a novelist to you're in a room and there's 8, 10, 12 people, whatever it might be, and you're collaborating. Like, what did you like about that? What was awful about that?
Well, it was extremely intimidating. This was David Simon and George Pelecanos and Richard Price. So sort of, these truly legendary figures. This was coming off The Wire and Treme, and it was, and they, you know, myself and Lisa Lutz, who's a crime novelist and a very good friend of mine, we were hired. Is the, they wouldn't call it this, but they kind of would jokingly, is the women. We knew them. I knew them all already. Not Richard Price, but David and George, because George is a crime novelist, and so we already, had a good rapport with them. But I definitely felt a lot of pressure because there's a show about sex workers to really make sure that it was speaking to the female characters on the show and pitching stories for them, and so it felt pressure beyond the usual pressures of trying to be heard in it wasn't that big a room. They liked to keep a small room, but I guess there was maybe 8 of us, and it felt it was very intimidating. But they made a lot of effort to listen to everything we had to say, and really they were great to work with, but it was intense. I mean, it was intense room. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, it was an intense show. I mean, so that makes sense. At what point did Dare Me become a television show?
yeah, it was during the second season of The Deuce, so I actually had to leave in the middle of the second season because we got a green light for the pilot, and then
Oh, wow.
and so that all kind of overlapped, and then we were off to the races. So 7 years into 6 years into the development, all of a sudden we were gonna get to shoot. So it was a different kind of collaboration. Production is like extreme collaboration, though you in some ways you are the creative boss of it, but you're
Hmm.
dealing with a lot of moving parts and budget and department heads with great ideas of their own, and kind of really the most exhilarating experience of my life, but very, very different than writing by yourself as a novelist in your room.
Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about the casting process in terms of like you have these characters in your head, and then people start walking into a room pretending to be them. That has to be a pretty strange experience.
It does, and I learned quickly that you can't be too wedded to your any ideas in your head. You have to be open to possibility, because none of the everybody turned out differently than I imagined, and they were all better. But it was you're really looking for this spark or energy that you can't quite explain. There's something so mysterious about the process, and then of course how the chemistry that they have with one another, and there's something so intangible and mysterious about it all. But the exciting thing of having a show in production is then you can start to write to the actor as they transform the character, and bring out different things and bring out more humor than you anticipated, or more menace. And so that's all really exciting, that part of it for sure.
Was there a particular actor or particular performance in Dare Me that surprised you? And maybe that was in the book, that's from the book, but when you saw it come to life, you just thought about it in a different way from when you had first created it.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily different, but the character of Beth, who's sort of quote unquote villain of the book, who's a pretty scary cheerleader. So,
Yeah.
she was the hardest to cast because you would get a lot of actresses coming in and doing a version of a mean girl, which is
Mm.
not what we wanted at all. I mean, I always said to Marlo Kelly, who ended up playing her, and really one of the most extraordinary performances I've ever seen, and that's not a it says no reflection on the writing of it, but she's just an amazing actress. But she, I always told her that I thought that the character of Beth is in her world, she's the hero of this story,
Mm.
and Marlowe just knew just what to do. That she gave her this sort of Shakespearean tragedy feeling, and she, she was quite frightening when she would act, and she's so sweet in real life, and she just made it all come alive and had this gravitas that we just simply could not find in any other actress. She did not. It did not seem possible that someone could hold the screen that easily just by looking into the camera. She was just so extraordinary. And then when you see that an actress can do that, you just lean into it with the writing.
I don't know if I learned this from Dare Me or if I had learned this previously. I believe cheerleading is the sport, the high school sport that injures the most kids. And knowing that is like this is a tough world, and these are tough people that we're following.
That's right. You have to be fearless because, unlike football players, they have no protective equipment. There's nothing stopping them from falling 25 feet, onto the ground, and their head hits the pavement, or the grass or the gym floor, which happens all the time. I mean, it's just requires a kind of crazy bravery. So we always thought of them as Marines more than anything.
It's brutal.
Yeah.
Now, were you a cheerleader
No.
at NYU?
No, no, I was never a cheerleader. I was never the cheerleader type. I have no athletic ability, and I always write about female athletes. So I think there's some wish fulfillment there.
You do it well, so there's got to be something. There's got to be something. Um, so one of my favorite Elmore books, La Brava, for a lot of reasons. I've read it a handful of times. I've read it over and over. There's so many really, really interesting things he's doing in that. I took a shot just based on, and it's mainly some of the essays that you've written that made me think that you might like it too. But I'm really curious to hear about what you think of La Brava, because I don't think when most people think of Elmore, they think of that book, but I think it has to be considered one of his best books.
I think so. It was the one he won the Edgar for. And I think it put him in a new echelon. And I mean, for me, it was Ace Atkins, a crime novelist, friend of mine, who recommended it to me
Oh,
many,
really?
like that was like 20 years ago that he recommended it to me, and I had not read it yet. And he knew of my love of movies and film noir, and of course that's a piece of the book. And it's so steeped in this sort of ennui and regret, romantic regret of noir, um, and so, I mean, he knew that I would love it, and I did. And I love I mean, short of the sort of characterization, the sense of place is one of the things I also love most about Leonard's books. But that sort of early 80s Art Deco Miami area is so rich, and it's sort of right before, Miami Viceification of everything. It's still, I mean, it has a lot of Detroit energy, to be honest.
Right.
This sort of decaying grandeur from the mid-century, and there's it's just a very mysterious and romantic book. And I mean, I love his sort of more his funnier romps and his more violence, but there is something in this that I don't think he does too much. It has a kind of weight and kind of mournful quality that just is just completely entrancing.
There's something about the use of the camera, and we will, for everyone listening, we will do a full deep dive in La Brava, but it's so good that we can't not talk about it right now. But so Joe LaBrava, he's sort of a professional photographer, but he's constantly taking pictures. So there's this really interesting dynamic of detachment, but then also we get to sort of follow Joe as he's developing the film. And this was written in the 80s before digital photography. And you have, he's in the dark room and he's got bowls of chemicals and he's seeing these images. And so there's the way that a character can be detached from what they're looking at and then so engrossed by it. It really has a great has a great effect. And then also because Gene Shaw, who, now I don't want to give anything away, but for God's sake, people, go read La Brava. This is your official spoiler alert. I don't know how to describe her other than she had been essentially a star of film noir films, typically as a femme fatale, and maybe she just brought her work home with her.
Yes.
But I'm curious. I would love to just hear you talk about Jean, particularly because you have really studied film noir much more than I have, and I'm just curious what you think of her.
Yeah, I mean, she's really the center, the sort of, the heartbeat that thrums through the book and our relationship to movies, but particularly noir, because they seem to speak to our unconscious. There's something dreamlike about noir, and sort of there's a lot of sort of quote unquote perversity in noir. They're the stuff you can't say aloud, and in noir, it's where it all is let loose. And Elmore Leonard loved old movies as much as anyone in the world, and I think you feel his love of that through it and through her. And I think he writes great women, but I think she's one of the best because he's not satisfied with simple characterization of her. He gives her all this dimension without ever taking away um, any of her mystery,
Right.
which I love. And I always think I'm always when I think about that book, writers are by nature voyeurs, and then you have a writer writing a book about a photographer, which is like a
Right.
double layer of voyeur. And so he's doing so much with it, because then you're thinking of young Joe in the cinema watching movies, and you have another layer of voyeur. So there's just there's a lot of layers in that book that I don't think are conscious, and nor should they be, because I think you're really feeling the writer experiencing the book in real time, it feels like, almost, and her falling in love with her, Jean, in real time, which, the way he talked about his writing process, I kind of believe he did, because he's so improvisational in his writing.
How did you? I want to keep talking about La Brava, but I also, what was it like interviewing him, and how did that come about?
It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. I only wish that we could have done it in person, but I might have been too nervous. So it was the LA Times magazine. Um, I was asked to interview him, and I forget what the tie-in was. This might have been when the Karen Cisco series premiered.
I
I
think it was Raylan. I think it was.
Raylan, that's right, because the book was, yes, that's right. It was Raylan. So it was tagged to that, but we had a kind of roving conversation, and he was so warm and delightful, and so dear, and so funny, and it was sort of everything you fear, is that you'll get to talk to your heroes, and they will be, they're
Yeah.
not always what you want, and he was so much more. And he asked me questions about me, and then he made sure to get a copy of one of my books, and then his assistant, his researcher Greg, sent a picture to me of the book on his table, which was so nice. So it was really kind of the dream experience with all that, and it was really.
What did he ask you?
He wanted to know what books I had inspired me, and he wanted to know why I loved hard-boiled fiction, because the book that he read, Queenpin, it was his. My first few books are all very much in that vein, and we talked about the women and the femme fatale, and I asked him about. I mean, he loved women, and you feel, and it's not always true with some of the. I mean, sometimes you feel. I love all the hard boiled stuff, but sometimes you feel real anxiety about women, and sometimes a contempt, and that he's
Mhm.
so the opposite. And he just seemed to. It was just like he wanted to have a conversation. I had to actually
Right.
Yeah, I had to actually keep reminding myself that I need to get some official questions in for our official purpose. So it was, yeah, a sheer pleasure in every way. And Greg Sutter was so helpful in connecting us, and was great through that process.
Greg is great. I met him, talked about this, previously on the podcast, but I worked on the adaptation of Freaky Deaky. I got to have dinner with it was at Peter's house, and Elmore's son, and Elmore was there. I was very much sort of on the producing team, but I was lucky to be invited, and I was there. And my then girlfriend, a lovely person, she was visiting me that weekend. But so we went to the dinner, and we're deferring to everybody because we just want to be there. And it was time to eat, time to sit down. Elmore went into the dining room and just sort of sat down right in the middle of the table. And we walked in next. We weren't sure where to sit, so we just where should we sit? And Elmore pointed at my girlfriend and said, "You sit here," and pointing at the chair next to him. They chatted the whole night, and they're talking about things that I had never heard. And it was really, for me to get to see the curiosity of somebody who, writes at that level, get, turned on, and then see them dig. And it was just kind of a wild experience.
But it makes so much sense because you see the curiosity in all the books, that
Yeah.
his curiosity in human nature and human foibles, and it's like he's constantly mining for story, and just really fascinated by why people do the things they do, and how they talk about it, and also that ear for the way people talk is, and the way they tell their story too.
Yeah, I think it's that combination of that curiosity and empathy that he had, and yeah, just seeing him kind of turn it on was pretty cool. I'm curious. I do want to talk a little bit more about Gene, who is kind of the protagonist of La Brava. I mean, there's Joe's doing stuff, but he's kind of responding to everything around him. And as we learn about two-thirds through the book, it's Gene who's really driving all this action, ultimately. Do you think that's something that, just as a experienced, accomplished, successful novelist, do you think that's something that Elmore always had planned, or do you think he found that in the moment?
Boy, I mean, I wouldn't want to speak for him, but he does often talk about how he finds the story. As he writes, he often talks about how, and I don't think Gene ever would have been a minor character in that book, but how minor characters get pushed to the center. And
Hmm.
so, but on the other hand, I think the book is all Gene, really. I mean, I think he's telling her story through everyone else is helping tell her story. Yeah. So they're all this constellation. All the other characters are this constellation around which she is the center. So it's hard to believe that he didn't know in advance or figure out early on that that's what it was going to be. Because you could just feel his fascination for her. Sort of that thing you always want in writing, when it leaps from you trying to tell the story you think you want to write till the character's telling you what you're going to be writing. And that's how, that's when it lifts off.
Is there a point in your process where that typically happens?
Yeah, I mean, often it doesn't happen, and then you have to abandon the book. I've abandoned many books like 100 pages in because it just
Oh,
doesn't
wow.
have that take off. It has to kind of find its own rhythm and feeling, and it has to kind of do things you don't expect. And that the only thing, I mean, you can't make it happen. The only thing I've learned is to be patient,
Hmm.
and and not push, because it won't happen if you push. So it's just one of the things that, it's just sort of the, I guess in some ways it separates the men from the boys in terms of writing, because if you can't be patient enough to wait for that, and you don't have the discipline to stick with it, probably not going to like writing. So as so much of it is that, is sort of enigmatic how it happens. If or just there's just, maybe it's just too, that for me, and it certainly feel that way, that you feel that in Elmore Leonard's books, there's no pleasure if it doesn't do that. It's just it's just lining up incidents otherwise. Um, it's just sort of plot mechanics. And one of the things I always loved about Leonard's books is that he's not that interested in plot. And I love that.
I got to read the Cooler Than Cool, the biography that's coming out in a few months, and one of the things that comes up is just his routine and how diligent he was. And it's like when you're working that hard at something, like you have more opportunities for these happy accidents to
Yes.
to come. Do you have a routine when it comes to writing books?
Yeah, I have so many. I mean, it sort of gets to be insane, but it's sort of like always the things that I mean, I write most of the day every day, but very little of that day is actually writing. But I can't do other things during the day. Like, I can't have lunch with people. I never have lunch with people because if I know I'm having lunch, I'm not going to get anything done in the morning because I got to get ready for lunch.
Right.
And then when I come home, I'm not gonna be writing. So it's sort of no. So I have to mark out the day and have to keep in the world of the book or the script all day. So when I'm actively writing, or I'm taking the walk to figure out a story problem, or getting the mail, or all this, or getting coffee, all these sort of rituals that writers have that are designed to have you not have to interact with the world directly, so that you're Walter Mosley's talked about this. You have to keep yourself open to the unconscious has to be open to you throughout the writing day. And he talks about how you have to write every day, which I do, but not all of it looks like writing. Sometimes you're just going over what you've written. Sometimes you're just thinking about a plot problem. But most of that stuff is actually more important than putting a string of sentences together, because you're really figuring out what the book is, how it moves, what its structure is. So, you can sit and produce a page or two, but it's meaningless if you don't have that larger thing happening. So, I think that's really true, and I think the discipline of writers like Mosley and certainly Elmore Leonard, who's so prolific, knew that had to be the way it was. It has to come first.
Is there a moment where you feel like you are coming to a realization about something? You have some insight where it's like you feel like I have to go starting putting pen to paper now, or do you just let it kind of come over you and then you'll revisit it whenever it's time?
Well, for instance, if I'm not at home and I think of something, I will usually just send an email to myself. And then in the morning, I have these notes of sort of what I figured out. Usually it's a plot thing in my case, is realizing, like, solving plot. When you write crime novels, things there's certain expectations, but they're also just story expectations. You know, you have to have stakes, you have to have surprise. That's often the stuff that's sort of the least natural to me. Mood and dialogue and character is more natural. But then I'll send these emails to myself, and then in the
Mhm.
morning I have the emails, and then I start writing. But I'm always kind of, I mean, I talk about this with the writers. You're always kind of writing in your head, whether you're writing or not. And so it isn't I mean, nothing beats time sitting at the desk as I'm sitting now and actually writing. But to make that happen, all this other stuff is required.
Is there, like, at what point, I guess I have two questions. So the first is, let's just start with this. Sorry, I have three questions. Uh, so is your routine the same for Scott Frank told me that you guys are working on a few things together. So when you're writing screenplays, is it the same process or is it completely different?
It is different. I should say that in many ways, Elmore Leonard brought us together because I was a fan of Scott, from Out of Sight, one of the greatest scripts of all time, which is one of the movies I saw that made me, go on this, years long Elmer Leonard binge. But I mean, that's, collaboration is different. We're working on two projects together, and then you have this sort of hot potato energy that's great because you're feeding each other. It's very different. When I'm writing a script alone, though, it's not the same at all because you have to map it out. You have to do the outline, and my outlines are basically scene by scene. This is
Hmm.
very different than how I write a novel. And so when I sit, it's actually much easier because I have figured out the structure, even though it might change in the outline. So I'm just writing scenes. So it's just a much more regimentalized process. So you can write a lot faster. It's just simpler. It's not, though you will revise it 1,000 times, which I don't do with my novels. I mean, I revise them a lot, but not like you do with a script because you're writing for committee for the most part. So you're getting a lot of feedback. And so in some ways it requires a different kind of discipline, which is to be receptive, but also know that you ultimately have to do what you feel is right with the script. So there's just different skills called upon. So I feel like they're quite different. So it is. I do like going back and forth. One day I'm working on a script, next day I'm working on a novel because the novel is so much more interior. It's more fits and starts. It's so much more, rambling and serpentina process.
How did you start? How did that come about that you're working with Scott Frank?
Yeah, he had approached me. He had read, I think, a couple of my books. Unbeknownst to me, I mean, if I had known he was reading my books, I would have been pounding on his door. But this was in 2020, about if I had any interest in working on a feature script with him for Nabokov's Laughter in the Dark, which is one of his early novels set and written in Berlin in the early 1930s. So very, very, very charged time. Well, it's very noir. It's his most noir book. It's really a love triangle. It's really like a James M. Cain plot because it's a married man with children, a respectable business person who becomes enthralled with a young woman, and he becomes sort of trapped in what they used to call a honeypot situation. So it's very noir, which is, I think, what one of the reasons. I mean, that Scott thought of me because and we've had a great time working on it.
And it sounds like is that in production or is that going to be?
Hopefully soon. It's in those tentative stages of
Well, if
bringing it
they're
up.
making T-shirts, it's got to be pretty far along. So,
Good T-shirt. I think Scott may have been pulling your leg on.
oh man,
But we are also working on adaptation of Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest. So that will happen. That's with A24. So it's exciting, and it's
that's
just
very exciting.
like learning from the master. Is Scott is so amazing, and it's hard to adapt Elmore Leonard, and to do it twice is really hard.
All of those things that you're talking about are probably not. I think there's a reason why they haven't been adapted before, and so that doesn't sound. It sounds like you guys have. It doesn't sound easy, but it sounds like between the two of you, you'll handle it.
Yeah, Red Harvest is one that people have tried to adapt forever. It was a rights situation, so they've adapted it illegally, like changed the character name. It's been adapted many times,
Oh,
with including Yojimbo, Kurosawa. So, but
oh,
finally we're able to get the official rights. So it's one of those ones that people were dying to adapt because it's really kind of a thrilling story and really I think the blueprint for American crime fiction in many ways. I mean, it's a very Leonard-esque uh, story, so it's real true blue.
no, it's super exciting. I want to ask you: is there a point where like how do you know when one of your books or one of your scripts is done?
Well, when I'm sick of it. That's my honest answer.
Fair
I mean,
enough.
I was just saying this to someone the other day that there's such a relief when as a perfectionist, like to a fault, when I can't look at it anymore. Otherwise, I would work on it forever. I mean, it's monstrous, but there's a point at which you're just making it worse. And that's when I know I'm done. I think so. So that's certainly true in the revision process. First draft,
Mhm.
I know I really write in sequence, so I know it's done when I've got to the ending scene. But the final done is really when I just can't. I can't see it anymore. That's usually what.
Interesting. Do you have so? And I'm curious because you do both. You write books and also television. Do you have a rule? So I have I have a personal belief about what a movie needs to achieve. And if it doesn't, it can be great, but I won't look at it as a movie. So my crazy controversial opinion on this is I love There Will Be Blood by, Paul Thomas Anderson. I think it's a great work of art. I think the movie is the first 10 minutes when he falls down the well and then climbs up and he basically climbs into town. And then everything after that, he is exactly the same. He impacts the environment, but the environment has no impact on him. Do you have a rule? Like, do you have a rule about what a novel has to do, or what a story being told on television has to do for it to live up to the medium?
I mean, I think for me with movies, and there are many exceptions to this rule. Movies I love, but the reason I go to the movies is that I want to be visually. I want there to be a spectacle, and that
Yeah,
doesn't have to. And in fact, doesn't in my case. I'm not interested in explosions, etc. But I want to. I want to have my eyes fed. My one of my movie heroes is David Lynch, and
mm,
he's a perfect example. That those are not conventional Hollywood movies in any way, but I see stuff in there that I'd never see or imagine if I weren't
sure.
seeing him in a David Lynch movie. So for me, there has to be spectacle. I think TV I view more closer to novels because the form is closest, which is there needs to be story to beat the band. There has to be so much to uncover because of the serial nature of it. You has to be mystery layered upon mystery, and I don't necessarily mean a formal mystery, but there has to be so many layers to sift through. It's interesting what you say about There Will Be Blood. I mean, I feel like that is a common, the character needs to change, but I won't know if he's the character. I don't know if he's the main character. I think that the Paul Dano character is the main character. He's the one who changes. I think of the Daniel Day-Lewis is more like John Huston in Chinatown or something. I don't.
Same voice.
Yeah, exactly. So and I don't actually think the main character needs to change, but I understand what you mean. That's just what they say about novels too. But I think that he is not that he's so intoxicating a figure and so dynamic that you're going to him, but I don't think he's the
Well,
protagonist.
he's like the volcano in a volcano movie.
Yeah, but the volcano doesn't change.
It's terrifying. Yeah, so that's a great point. That's a great point.
No, I like to think about it. I think, when I will say when it's not working, that is
It
often the
doesn't stop me from watching it over
no.
and over.
Well, and people do. Now we're getting into a sidebar about P.T. Anderson. I do know that the shaggy, quote unquote, shagginess of his plot does bother a lot of people. And I would say in some of his movies, I think Phantom Thread is not like that, but Licorice Pizza, or that he in some ways I think his plots are more novelistic in that way. But it is interesting to think about like what we come to, and then and then we're surprised when the thing we thought we needed isn't there. I mean, there's many movies I've seen that have like small character dramas where there's no spectacle, and they're very but I love them. So I guess we have these rules and then we break them constantly.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Paul Thomas Anderson is one of the great filmmakers ever. So what do I know? But I do think with Elmore, there are some of his books that, and we talked a little bit about this with Mr. Scott Frank, with Get Shorty, the ending of the book Get Shorty is, I mean, it's basically, boy, our ending's tough. And I don't remember the exact line. But in a book, it's totally fine. It is satisfying, but you got to do something else for a movie. I think Elmore, just going back to La Brava, I think the ending of La Brava is one of the all-time perfect endings.
It is, and I think it's these different veins that Leonard wrote in, because Get Shorty, in a lot of his novels, especially his later novels, are voice novels. I always think of them. They're not story, and so with voice novel, you can get away with the ending of Get Shorty. In fact, that's the ending it should be, but
Yeah.
that doesn't work in a movie. I mean, it's the constant problem of adaptation is to how to capture the voice of the book, whether there's a first person voice or the character. There's this intimacy to it that you feel like you're in conversation with the characters and distinctive voice. So that's something that he was so good at. But that's different than La Brava and some of his other novels that that have all these other elements as well. And they all are great, but they're different. I think he had different tracks. Don't you think?
Oh yeah. You don't know what you're going to get with his books, and you do have there's potential for any character to come back, just about, but also for any character to do something in a way that you don't anticipate it. And I think that that's just one of my favorite things about his work. We talked about La Brava. Is there another book of his that maybe isn't as well known that you think everybody just has to go out and read right now?
I wouldn't know how to. I mean, I guess it depends. I think I wouldn't even know where to begin. I mean, I suppose if they came to him through TV, I mean, I think I wouldn't even know. People like have different interests, because some of his are rides. You're going on a ride, and they're so funny and snapping. And I would recommend different ones to them than I would, So yeah, I feel like there's something for
Read them
everyone.
all.
And you just have to, find your way in, or just, honestly, I do think he's one of those few authors where you can go to the first page and you'll know that this is the one for you, because you were dropped right in immediately, and you're just, I mean, that voice, it's that voice, that ear for people, that just draws you in.
Other than Elmore, you mentioned earlier some other writers that got you excited about writing initially, or that you're reading now that are really exciting to you that you think people should be paying attention to and spending time with.
Yeah, I'm a big lover of Charles Portis. He's one of my favorites. He certainly has a lot of the humor of Elmore Leonard. This is much more like hard to characterize his books. I mean, he's most famous for True Grit, which is a perfect novel. But I mean, Dog of the South, and Norwood are spectacular books. He's like a one of a kind voice. He's like no other. So I do love a lot of Southern fiction in general, and I'm on to its rhythms, for sure. I mean, I grew up reading Flannery O'Connor, and that all looms quite large for me. But I read a lot of nonfiction too. I find that helps me a lot with, if I'm deep in a novel, I tend to move away from fiction till I've finish the novel, and because the rhythms can get in my head, so I read a lot of true crime and books about Hollywood, biographies. I just finished the Diaries of Kafka, which were great, the new translation. So I try to I try to mix it up. It's always my goal. I try to mix it up.
What's the best part of the Diaries of Kafka? Like,
So they're so funny. I mean, he's so unhappy, and he's so funny about it. And I love the way he describes. I mean, the way he describes people. He has this extended passage of watching this cleaning woman with I guess, an ample bosom, and how uncomfortable he thinks she must be because she's on her knees, scrubbing the floor, and she looks so weighed down by her health. I mean, he puts it politely, even more politely than I do. But
right.
I love the thought of Kafka, noticing that through his doorway in his apartment building. It's great.
Megan, thank you so much for joining us. This was a thrill, and we really appreciate your time. I don't want to keep you from your lunch or your writing any further. So we'll say thanks, and
It's so much my pleasure. I mean, I would talk about Elmore Leonard for an hour anytime and consider it a gift. So it was great.
great. Well, we'll pick this up at this time tomorrow.
Great.
The Elmore Leonard Podcast is produced and edited by Judd Rubin. Music by Greg Ahee. Hosted by Judd Rubin and Alex Leonard. Executive produced by Peter Leonard. Copyright 2025, Elmore Leonard Inc. Please visit us at elmoreleonardofficial.com or send us an email at hello@theelmoreleonardpodcast.com.